All right, if I could ask everybody to take their seats again. Great, good to see the energy in the room still so high. That's terrific. So this is our final session for the day. And what we really want to try to do with this session is to consider what have we learned over the course of the day, what are some of the things that we can take forward with us. And I think as Positive Energy, as somebody mentioned earlier in the day, we're very much a research and engagement initiative, which means that we look to those of you who are participating in our sessions to help shape the work that we're undertaking going forward. So it's very much a co-development model, and we look to you for your thoughts. So this final session, what we wanted to do is invite a number of members of the Positive Energy team, so to speak. So we have a number of our advisory council members and a member of our research team up on the stage here today. So Aimee Richard, who is a member of the Positive Energy research team, she came to us through a special program at the undergraduate level at the university for very top performing students, and she has not disappointed. In fact, she's graduated, and we've said, Aimee, you're not going anywhere. You're still continuing to do work with us, so we're delighted to have her continue to be on the team. We also have Dave Lai from Encana. Encana has been a supporter of Positive Energy from the very outset, so we're very grateful for that support, and delighted to have Dave with us here today to provide an industry perspective. Beside Dave is Tonja Leach, who is also a member of our advisory council. The work that Quest does with community energy planning is a really important component to thinking about Canada's energy future in an age of climate change. So we're delighted to have Tonja with us to share her perspectives from the work that Quest has been doing. And then the final member of the panel is Niilo Edwards. Very quick story about Niilo. So Niilo and I met a couple of years back. I think it was Stuart Muir from ResourceWorks who put us in touch originally. And so I got a little note from Niilo saying, going to be in town. Would you be interested in meeting? Well, yeah, I'd love to meet with you. So Niilo is Executive Director of the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. I'm sure he'll tell you about it in a moment. Anyway, and Niilo probably knows where I'm going with this story. So the first time we meet, I'm imagining Niilo coming to my office and we'll have a nice discussion. And well, Niilo shows up to my office and he's got 6 Indigenous First Nations chiefs with him. I think, well, I didn't know that was going to happen. This is terrific. So we're all sort of sitting on each other's laps in my office, and that was how I got to know the First Nations Major Projects Coalition and the absolutely tremendous work that they're undertaking. So we're delighted to have Niilo serve on our advisory council, and really glad to have his perspective on the panel today. So what we're going to ask each of our panelists to do, and then we're going to open it up to the audience, is really to reflect a little bit on what they've heard today, and to answer, in essence, a couple of key questions. One of which is sort of what are some of the key learnings that you're taking away today? Are there things that you heard that you wouldn't have expected to hear? Something that surprised you? Was there a new idea that you've developed over the course of the day? Is there something that you're going to apply in your work going forward? Really just top of mind ideas. And for us, this will be really helpful, I think, going forward with our research. I think one of the ways I'm thinking about this session is that a lot of our day today is talked about politics, right? So it's looked at public opinion polling research, other work that we've done around polarization, but we're a decision-making shop. Right, Positive Energy, what we do, our mandate, is how to strengthen public confidence in energy decision-making. And so that means the work of policymakers, of regulators, of Indigenous governments, of municipal governments, of the courts, how all of these different bodies interact with one another. So if you're, amongst those public authorities, how do you navigate this polarized environment? And how do we move from what I'm increasingly sort of thinking of as short-term politics to long-term durable policy? And durable certainly means policy that has broad-based confidence of the public and also confidence of investors, as we've heard throughout the day as well. So without further ado, I think we'll turn to our panel. I'll join all of you here, and then we'll open it up. We're going to use Polev again and get some input from the audience and some questions from all of you as well. So, Aimee, you are the first up.
Great. Thanks so much, Monica. I'd just like to say I'm really grateful to have had the chance to listen to all of you today, some really inspiring thoughts and interesting ideas from our panelists. Monica mentioned my background a little bit, but I'll just explain to give you some better context of where I'm coming from. I grew up in Calgary, and then I studied here in Ottawa, and now I'm based out of Quebec City. So those sort of personal experiences really inform how I come at this question of climate change or polarization in an area of climate change. And I know people who are close to me who've protested on the front lines for pipelines in BC, but I also have people who are close to me who will proudly wear their I Heart Alberta Oil and Gas t-shirts. And so that sort of personal experience is really where I'm coming from here, from personal, but also from an academic perspective. And thinking about what we've been talking about today, the sort of two key takeaways for me would be the idea of trade-offs. A lot of people talked about that. And then secondly, sort of the question or the problem of the people in the middle when we're talking about polarization. But first to the question of trade-offs, I think a lot of, in this context, we'll have to make difficult decisions. And we talked about how there are costs and there are trade-offs associated with that. But the trade-offs, I think, really also depend on your specific energy context. So where you're coming from, me as a young woman living in a city, my trade-offs are probably very different from someone, working in the oil sands. And I think that question of what we're willing to trade off is very dependent on that context, and the data sort of touched on that a little bit, the data we saw this morning. But we also talked about the idea that overall people crave stability. And when we're talking about decisions, we want stability, politically and whatnot. And I think stability is a luxury that we're enjoying now, but the nature of climate change is such that 10, 20, 30 years from now, we might not enjoy that same level of stability. So it's actually a lot more preferable to be making these tough decisions now because we have this stability. And when we're talking about trade-offs, we can either be thinking carefully through these costs and these trade-offs now in an era of relative stability, or we might have these difficult decisions forced on us in 20, 30 years. Because I think it was Catherine earlier who said, climate action is not a choice. We have to do it. And I think a sort of interesting anecdote that I'll use to illustrate my point is earlier on in this spring, there were the floods outside of Montreal, which, is a phenomenon associated with climate change as well, these extreme weather events. But the evacuation order went out. It's anecdotal, but the evacuation order went out. And some people refused. They said, no, the flood's not going to happen. I don't need to evacuate my house. So the flooding is an unfortunate reality. Nobody wants to face that reality. But at least if you have some time, 12 hours to prepare, you can, decide what you want to take with you in this case of a flood. Is it my grandmother's, heirloom china? Is it, precious belonging? But then, if you refuse the evacuation order, you delay, eventually the flood waters are at your front door and you don't have the choice anymore. So that difficult decision has been forced upon you. And not only do you have to leave the heirlooms behind, you might also have to leave your beloved cat behind. And I think we can sort of use that example to think about we have to make these difficult decisions now when we do have this era of relative stability instead of 10, 20 years from now when, these, so to speak, floodwaters are right at our front door. Then the second point, my sort of second key takeaway, was some people have touched on the idea of the people who are in the middle. The theme here is polarization, but there's obviously a large sector of the population there that's in the middle. And a really sort of illustrative example for me, my own personal experience, was about at the beginning of the year, I went home to Calgary to visit my parents. And after I'd been in the door for about 10 seconds, my mother looks at me, dead serious, and she goes, "Aimee, we don't say the word pipeline in this house." And I think that, just goes to show the extent of sort of this polarization that even pipeline is a dirty word, can't even be said in around the dinner table. But again, as I think someone said earlier, pipeline, of course, is just sort of a buzzword for, the more complex issues that we're facing. But if someone like my mother, who isn't deeply involved in the energy sector, that's her only perspective, is that all she sees or all she thinks about these difficult questions is how polarized it is, how nasty it's gotten. That I think we sort of risk alienating that big section of the people in the middle. They can't even come to the table, can't even have these conversations because they don't want to get involved in this sort of nasty discourse of polarization. So I think we have to think pretty seriously about how do we get those people in the middle who aren't as involved, aren't as implicated in these questions as we are. But yeah, thanks so much. Those are my sort of key takeaways.
Thanks. As was mentioned, my name's Dave Lai. I'm with Encana. I lead our external affairs and government relations teams. I'm, I guess, the energy industry guy on the panel. I've been with Encana for about 20 years. I grew up in British Columbia. I've been in Alberta, like I say, 20 years or so, and I've kind of lived this world of trying to get projects approved and projects moving. I thought today's conversation was great. There are a ton to absorb. And before I talk about my takeaways, I thought maybe I'd talk a little bit about the trajectory that I've been on in my brain as I've sat and listened. And I started going back to that idea of what I do for a living, which is try to advance our business. And Nick's comments and the polling showing that there is a movement of Canadians to believe that the national interest is more important than the local interest in advancing projects. And I was quite hopeful and optimistic from that, because that's something that I believe and a lot of people in our industry believe, that what we have to contribute contributes to the national interest, not just that of Alberta. And then as the morning kind of moved on and Nick and James and Stephen shared more in depth their analysis, I became discouraged, because it became clear, I think, polarization is alive and well, and on a bunch of dimensions. We've talked about rural versus urban, gender-based, regional across the country, and felt that, well, though there's these green shoots of maybe getting a national imperative going and being able to rally around as a country, there's still lots of divisions. But then, especially with the last panel, I kind of left feeling a lot more hopeful. And I was particularly struck by Larissa's and Catherine's comments. Larissa's comments around that idea of a shared history and shared future, and that intergenerational collaboration, because I think that's something that we need to find a way of working together and listening to other alternatives if we're going to move away from the polarization. And then Catherine's comments about having a conversation, shifting the conversation to what we all want, because I think we're probably all very similar in that. Despite our diverse backgrounds and what I do for a living, what other people do for a living, at the end of the day, I think we want prosperity for our children and a clean environment for future generations. And so I think we're a lot closer to that than some of the polling and frankly, some of the politicians would let us believe. So that leaves me to my key takeaway, and Nick touched on it this morning, but it's this need for having honest conversations that don't seem to be occurring, and talking about the trade-offs, talking about what if we alienate one region, what that does both economically, but what that does for us as a country and as a confederation. And the other thing that struck me is the need for some shared language and shared understanding. And Marissa's work around transition was a good example of that, and coming to an understanding of what words like transition mean, so that we are actually working to a shared end goal rather than talking beyond each other. But what does a national interest mean? What is the future energy mix? And even what does an honest conversation mean? I'm sure that's a value-based thing that we all bring a different perspective with. And really figuring out how to shift the conversation and get to the problem-solving space that Christina mentioned, building a common understanding of the consequences of our decisions, using Rona's words, with our eyes wide open, so we know what it is we're saying yes to, but we also know what we're saying no to, or maybe the other way around. And then the last thought, we talked a lot about education. Having been in this space for quite a few years, we've, at least from an industry perspective, tried a lot of approaches around education. Most of it's terrible. And that left me wondering if we need more of Cameron's thinking in our conversations on the go forward. So I'll leave it there.
I think I'm good with this one. Thanks. You guys have both summarized, I think, a lot of what we heard very nicely. I'm not sure I have a lot to add to that because I think it was a lot of similarities around the benefits and the trade-offs. But the one thing that really stuck out for me, and I think this is kind of where the conversation needs to go because my dad had this little thing on his desk that said, are you here as part of the problem or the solution? And so I'm very much, I think we're at this moment in time where we're starting to shift, right? We've been talking about the problem for a very long time, and we might not necessarily all agree on what the actual problem is, but we're at a point where we can actually start talking about solutions. And that's where we need to go. So Quest is an organization, I should perhaps say a little bit about Quest. Our vision is that Canada is a nation of smart energy communities. And so what I think I heard a lot of today was that the solution to a lot of the challenges we face is actually grounding it in reality for Canadians. And so some of the things that, just gotta flip my notes here, some of the things that kind of stick out in that regard is if we can actually start to talk about solutions in the context of what matters, context of economic opportunities, local environmental quality, sustainability, resilient infrastructure, and affordability, then we actually have a conversation that we can work on together versus being polarized, increasingly polarized about what the problem is. So we see that smart energy communities recognize the challenge of climate change. They understand the importance of local, conventional, and renewable energy and making sure that all of those things are on the table, that we're not picking one solution over another. They understand that climate policy is built on a foundation of sound energy policy, that we're driving technology change while avoiding technological determinism, that we are maximizing the value of the assets, both existing and new, that we already have or that we will have. Coming to the point of institutional, so emphasizing institutional innovation. I think we're at a point now where we recognize the institutions that we've had for many, many years are not going to serve us well into the future, and so we have to enable a lot of innovation, not just technological innovation, but institutional innovation as well. We need to reduce, or smart energy communities understand that they need to reduce policy uncertainty through alignment and a sense of community. And I think that comes to the point that Larissa was making earlier. You shared it as well, Dave, about shared history, shared responsibility, and shared future. And of course, very near and dear to positive energy, restoring public trust and confidence in decision-making institutions. So smart energy communities recognize and appreciate those six things and probably in that order of importance. And so what I was hearing a lot of today is, about trade-offs and benefits, it's that local actually matters. We have to talk in ways that matter to Canadians, and if we can actually talk about what matters to them, let's face it, to steal the slogan from Enbridge, life takes energy. So no matter what your local challenge is, you can actually embed your energy solution in that challenge. And I think we need to be able to recognize that there is regional diversity, geographic diversity, so many different types of diversities. We don't have a cookie cutter solution, but taking a very principled versus prescriptive approach to our future and our energy transition is going to be critical to our success.
Good afternoon. Before I get to my comments on what was heard today, I'm just going to take a few moments to explain to you about our organization, what we do, and who we represent. The First Nations Major Projects Coalition is a First Nations-led business capacity organization, now with over 60 First Nations from 5 provinces and 1 territory who have come together to support each other through advancing their business interests through an informed decision-making apparatus that the coalition has established by being a convening power, as I say, of First Nations business interests. We do that by providing access to independent tools, advice, and capacity that our communities need to make informed decisions regarding development within their territories. Thanks to government funding from Canada, British Columbia, and Alberta, we're able to provide access to these services to our members free of charge. This is something that came through a grassroots movement of chiefs back in 2015, most of whom felt overwhelmed by the amount of resource development that was taking place in northern British Columbia. That amount of resource development has led to polarization in the communities, at council and at the membership level. Part of overcoming the challenge of polarization for our members is providing the tools and advice necessary for them to make an informed decision. Because when you do not have access to information about the project, or feel that you're forced into a situation where you have to take industry's word on what they're telling you, that creates a situation fraught with fear and anxiety as to where the community or group of communities is going to go. So over the past 5 years, we've been working to build an education process, build a capacity building process to overcome some of the challenges that we face that are historic and systemic because of the way Indigenous people have been precluded from the decision-making process and the active participation in Canada's energy economy and resource economy in general. Through this, one thing I've identified, along with David here has mentioned it, is the national interest. I believe to get to a full view of the national interest on energy projects, that includes Indigenous interests being addressed in order to satisfy these projects that are in the national interest of the economy of Canada. The Indigenous interest takes a few different paths. There's the quantitative benefits, the economic benefits, but more importantly, there's the qualitative benefits, something that we've taken a very strategic approach to address in our work that we do by ensuring that our members understand their ability to engage in environmental processes, in socioeconomic impacts of projects on the community, and also what their options are to become partners, and I mean true partners, in the business that is going on within traditional territories. And that the truest form of partnership in this case is a lot of the time through equity participation, which is a significant focus of our organization. And we're currently involved in supporting 3 or 4 different major projects at this current time, all of which have equity on the table as part of the benefits package. So, you know, just to summarize here, we've done this, we've taken this on ourselves at the direction of the communities because the communities saw a lack of leadership from anywhere else. And we knew that if we didn't start to do this ourselves and have communities lead it, that the leadership we need to sort out these challenges wasn't going to come from government and it wasn't going to come from industry, that First Nations had to do this themselves and to champion their own cause, to put it at the forefront of the agenda. And because we have started to do this in a strategic way, we are now bringing other partners into the room with us. The other partners include industry and to a lesser extent government. I think industry will always be more willing to cooperate with new challenges and innovations on this side over government, just simply because government is a beast unto itself and moves slowly. So just to summarize here, we are affected by the polarization issue. We are affected by national interest, and we are affected by the lack of leadership that goes on in this country. But we are overcoming those challenges, as I say, by taking the bull by the horns, so to speak, and developing our own solutions based on the needs of our communities. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. That's a terrific set of thoughts to get us started. I want to just maybe pull on a few threads that were put on the table here, and then we'll open it up to the room. We've talked about national interest and leadership. You've all sort of mentioned this in your remarks. I guess one question I would have been thinking through all day, because at the same time you've also talked about local action. So what is national interest and what is national leadership? Maybe this is a very naive question, dumb question, but what is it actually needed for? And I'm not suggesting it's not needed, but are we thinking about it in too broad of a way? Maybe there's a lot that can be being done at the local level. Maybe we're looking for too much at the national level. Any thoughts on that? And feel free to tell me I'm bonkers and should be thinking something different.
Jump in because I've been thinking the same thing, Monica.
That I'm bonkers?
No, not that part. No, but it sort of came out early in the day about in the research, right, about how the national interest was gaining ground, I guess, as kind of as some momentum. But then, as we were talking, it seems like the solution's in the local. So how do you find the common ground between those two polarized perspectives? I think what it comes down to for me right now is that we don't have a North Star as a country. We don't have like we are trying to get here. And that's what I think we are missing on that sort of in the national interest is that North Star. How we actually get there is the local, right? So the action is at the local level, but we need the North Star to know what direction we're all heading in. I think for me, that's where the two meet.
And that was going to be my answer as well. And what's lacking is North Star, or as I think of it, as our energy vision. And it's really hard to talk locally about how you're going to do something when you still got this massive debate across the country as to where's we're trying to go, what is the vision. And I believe that's what we're lacking is a vision that we can rally around as a national interest, and then start having those local conversations at the risk of piling on.
I agree with what's been said here. I'm not sure. No, there. Okay.
Keep talking.
I agree generally with what's been said here. However, I will say that as I stand back and look at the direction given to me by our organization, First Nations know what they want. They want an economy. They want to have influence over what happens within their traditional territories, and they want to be a part of the wealth that's being generated from their traditional lands. And they want to be a part of that on their own terms. I think there's a lot to be taken in terms of a national vision from where our Indigenous people are at in terms of their willingness to take a look at certain opportunities. Because when you don't have an economy, when you don't have the means to meet your day-to-day needs, you have only but up to go. And I think a lot of us, and I'll include myself in that, it's easy to be directionless when you don't have to worry too much about anything. But when you start to worry about where you're going, or have somewhere to get that's of the utmost importance, that's when you become driven and can focus on something. So I think for, not to be cliche in saying this, but I think as a country we've had it too easy, and that's how we've lost our direction.
Yeah, I would probably just echo similarly to what Tonja had said there, that we sort of are looking for that sort of guiding star, as you had said. But the question of national interest is a pretty ambiguous term, and we spoke about that earlier in the day, that we don't know what national interest really means, and you could define that in any way you want. What does that necessarily mean? But that because it's so ambiguous, it does present an opportunity for consensus. I think the data sort of showed that a lot of Canadians agree that, we can make these steps in the interest or in the national interest, but we have no sort of definition as to what that actual national interest is. But that's probably why the solutions do lie more at the community level, working towards that sort of hopeful guiding star.
All right, so the consensus is I'm not completely bonkers. But I'm going to push on it a little bit more then. So Dave, you used the phrase energy vision. And a question I'd love to hear all of you on, in the absence of an energy vision, has our North Star been essentially taken to be Canada's Paris commitments? And at some level, has that framed up the conversation in a way that has gotten us where we are? I'm leaving you guys lots of room to take that anywhere you want to take it. Thoughts, Dave?
Sure, and I believe completely that we've allowed, and before I start, don't misconstrue what I'm going to say. I think it's very important that we have a climate vision and a climate plan for the country. But what I think has happened is we're mixing up our energy vision, our energy plan, and our climate plan. And they're interrelated, but in my view, they're different. And to your point, we're not allowing that energy conversation to proceed, and that's being substituted by a climate conversation, which you could substitute Paris or however you want to do it. But until we understand as a country how we want to manage and develop, or if we want to develop our resource base and everything that brings, or in the absence of developing it, excludes, I think it makes it difficult and confusing to have the climate conversation. So that's where the way I think about it is they are independent but interrelated, and a solid energy vision allows, I think, a more clear, honest conversation on the climate side, if that makes sense.
I guess to have an energy vision, it's also got to be relatable, and I think that's where a lot of people struggle. Is you hear about the Paris targets, you hear about Kyoto, you hear about all of these things, and governments make these promises, and then nobody ever keeps them, and it becomes almost abstract to the average person, because they can't relate it to the landfill that might be a kilometer away, or the fact that the salmon are not returning to the river, or water levels are rising, or forest fires are happening at an alarming rate. There seems to be a disconnect between those actual realities and government commitments. So, I think if we're to go after a true climate vision here, it's got to be broken down into simple terms that people will understand and see themselves in before we can actually get the kind of buy-in that it takes to have a national vision on something like this.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to come back to one of the points that I made at the start, and I think so I agree that they're definitely interrelated, and we certainly can't develop climate policy in the absence of energy policy, and I think that's a big challenge that we have been doing that. But to Niilo's point, I think we're trying to be prescriptive, and we need to be principled, and that I think governments feel that they have to be prescriptive, but I don't. I think that's misleading. I think that's leading us in the wrong direction.
Can I just push you a little bit on that? To give an example of what would be the difference between prescriptive versus principled?
Yeah, I think it comes back to some of the other points I was making about, let's look at technology. I think that's the easiest one to point to, where we are choosing technological solutions or governments are choosing technological solutions as sort of, as a means to the transformation, the energy transformation we're seeing in Canada. So we're saying everything must be clean and green. It has to, that's the only way. Versus saying, taking a more principled approach. I'm using that word, and I'm trying not to, but a more principled approach to it, right? So we're not trying to choose any one solution. We're setting out the conditions for the right solution to get ahead. And I think that's perhaps a nuanced difference, but a different approach that we need to be thinking about.
Amy, did you want to add anything on this topic?
I guess just the one thing I would add is I was working on the transition or the research project related to the term low carbon transition, so how it's used and understood. And a lot of participants did point to sort of the Paris Accord as maybe that's the possible end state of what we're looking for, but it almost seemed as if, well, I guess we don't have anything else, so that's what we have to look to. So, there is sort of a need for something maybe more specific to us, something, as Niilo said, something maybe more relatable to us, so that we do have a better sort of idea.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I'd like to open it up to the audience. So there's two things we want to do, one of which is hear from you, and it could be questions to the panel or it could be comments from you. We're happy to receive either. The second is, Andrew, if you can bring up the poll everywhere, so hopefully all the instructions will come up again. Good, because I don't have them. And this is an open-ended question. It doesn't have to be a single word. So this is not going to be listed as a word cloud. It'll just sort of be a rolling set of entries from you. So you can use more than one word. You can actually write a sentence if you would like to write a sentence. So we'll have that just rolling as we move into questions and comments. I thought I saw... Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just a very brief comment. There's been a lot of discussion today about the national interest. I don't think anyone has mentioned the Constitution at all today. Section 92, provincial jurisdiction. If you think the provinces are going to give up control over energy, they're not. We also have Section 35, around the treaty rights. So there's some real constitutional barriers. Yes, healthcare is provincial jurisdiction, and with the funding or the spending powers, they were able to get a national program. I think that's a very different kettle of fish. So if someone could figure out how to solve the constitutional issues around national interest, which does not involve reopening the Constitution, we don't want to do that. There we go.
Responses at all from the panel while we're going to the next question? Any comments?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
I hear your point loud and clear, but that's why I think of the vision. If we could figure out how to have strong federal leadership that sets the vision, the North Star, and probably naive, but maybe those provincial pieces go away, right? If we're all kind of pulling in the same direction under the construct of the Constitution, perhaps that's the path forward, is kind of how I would think about it.
And I guess I'd just throw out there, do we need to put, while we've all been focused on Paris in 2030 and 2050, do we need to put that North Star far enough out in the future that it is palatable from a number of different provinces, and then provinces can then act in their own regional differentiation, I guess, towards that outcome. So maybe the Constitution doesn't have to be seen as a barrier, but we just need to set our goal far enough out in the future that it is, that you can actually work within the bounds of the Constitution we have, so we're not trying to open it back up again, I think.
Do we have the luxury of that time, though? Might be the other question.
please go ahead.
Thank you. Interesting point on the Constitution. Although, in fact, I would argue that the Constitution, Canadian federalism, and our Westminster system of government, as it's currently constructed, is definitely an impediment not only to this issue, but a number of issues critical to the success of this country, Indigenous self-determination being just another one. But I think to tackle these issues, we need to get beyond, we can't do that, or we shouldn't do that, because we might very well have to. So I wouldn't cut off any avenue just yet. But my comment was relating to a lot of what we've heard today about the lack of leadership and a Canadian plan. Has anyone heard of the PanCanadian Framework on clean growth and climate change? So obviously most of you have, but it hasn't come up. Nobody's named it, I don't think, unless I missed it. So what happened to that? Was it poorly communicated? We all know about it. How many other Canadians know about it? That's my question. Thank you.
Any comments from the panel on the Pan-Canadian Framework? Bruce looks like he's died.
I rather than getting back into the Pan-Canadian Framework, although it is relevant, there is a sense of urgency here. And I take Tonja's point about what if we can set it at a reasonable pace, that we've got some time. I just wonder, do we in fact have time? And there's a bit of basic arithmetic. 2030 is about, 2050 is about 30 years away. For anybody who's making an investment in a long-term energy investment, you need to know in a pretty certain way that what you're going to invest in is going to be allowable for 30 years. And we better get to a definition of the lodestar with a realistic sense of what that is and achievable, so that we can get on with getting there. But if we don't define what it is, I mean, ultimately that is the priority, to get to a sense of what we need to do. We need to know where we want to be. And if it is zero carbon, then that tells the oil and gas sector that they need to work on technology and sequestration and a whole series of other things that offsets whatever it is to get to there, if that is our consensus. And if it's something more fuzzy than that, then fine, but we need to know where we're going to go. We haven't got enough time left, really, to be too fuzzy about that for very long. That's what I think when I look at the math.
I would like to come back on a few things. First, on the Constitution. At the moment, the provinces have been testing whether the federal can act on climate change and at what level. So we're getting there, and we'll know how much the federal can really push, even though and energy will be touched by the side, because it's 80% of the emissions. But if it's tackled through environment, it will be tackled anyway. Second, national project doesn't have to be led by the federal. The provinces have been so weak at discussing between themselves and at working between themselves. And that's another avenue I think we need to push, is getting coalition of provinces to move together. There's strong gains in moving together. And they are essentially, this is almost absent from the discussion. Now we've seen the provinces working together against the federal for this tax, but they could be also working for something else. And I think those are essential issues, that a national vision is needed, because the size of the problem is such that working together will reduce the costs for everybody, but this can be done in many ways.
I'll leave it to the panelists to let me know if they want to jump in on anything. Otherwise, I'll just leave the mic to rove around. Yes.
So I was listening to, this is mainly probably a question for Tonja, but if other people want to give answers, that's great as well. So I think that you and I probably think relatively similarly, and I think a lot about heterogeneity. And I like to think about solutions. I like to think about multiplicity. I like to think about different things for different communities and different people. And then we're talking about one North Star. And I'm wondering if even you brought that up as like this vision. Do we need to have a vision, or does the vision need to be heterogeneity and embracing differences? And another piece I think that goes along with that is that regardless of a vision, people are going to do stuff. And so one example would be the cost of solar PV dropping enough that you can end up with a solar duck curve, just about anywhere, and that creates system instability. And are we thinking about that? Are we addressing that in different areas? So there's going to be things that people are going to do anyway within the current regulatory regime that are going to cause reactions. And that's where a lot of this, there's going to be heterogeneity at different scales and different things. So I'm just wondering, how do you reconcile that with the vision? How does that fit?
You probe some very challenging questions. I agree with you on the I can't say the word. Say it for me again. Thank you. I completely agree with you on that. I like to less formal words, but there's no cookie cutter, right? We can't apply the same thing across the country. It's just not going to work. But I do think that in the absence of having some direction from some national leadership, we run the risk of having a real mess on our hands, in that we have local action. We already have local action. We have an immense amount of local action. We just don't talk about it. But we run the risk of losing an immense amount of opportunity for efficiency and sort of learning from each other and a more iterative process towards the transition or through the transition if we don't have some kind of direction. So that would be my response, but I completely agree with you that the solution is going to be very different depending not just where you are provincially, but where you are locally.
Did anybody else want to comment on that? Okay, just before we get to the next question or comment, we have a second question for people. I'm conscious of time here. We have a second question we'd like to bring up now as well, to ask folks if they have some suggestions for us, action items for positive energy. So you've got, this research and engagement process is ongoing. As you know, we've created a forum. You are now part of the forum. We do not have a catch and release strategy, so hello, you're going to continue to hopefully engage with our work, and we would really, really appreciate any thoughts that you have in terms of action items for us coming out of this. Obviously, we're going to be finalizing all of these studies, but if there's something that you heard today where you're thinking, geez, I wonder if they're going to do that with the survey work or the case studies or what have you, please feel free to provide us with your thoughts, because this is something that we do take very seriously in our work as we go forward. Question over here. Yep.
Yeah.
Comment. Steve.
So I've been thinking about this, and I've been worried. We've been hearing a lot about the lack of national leadership, and I worry about that a lot. And I also worry about, so if we're not getting the vision from government that brings us together, then where might we get that vision? And about 10 days ago, Harvard University made an announcement that it's joining Climate Action 100 Plus, which is a group of investors worldwide. They currently have $34 trillion, that's with a T, $1 trillion in investments. It includes the California Public Pension Fund. This is a massive organization that's being put together by Ceres. And they're about to start pushing the 154 topmost carbon-emitting companies in the world to do better. And 9% out of those 154 companies are currently on track to address their obligations under on the Paris Climate Exchange. So I have two questions. So if we're thinking about that, and my university is about to think about dumping its endowment into the same thing, if this starts moving forward, we might get a consensus among the investor community, right? Because the rest of business right now is quite concerned about climate change because of the costs of doing business. PepsiCo, GE, right, across the spectrum of businesses. And so the question is, can we look to either our leaders for some sort of vision, or an alternate idea, perhaps to the energy industry for some sort of vision that brings us, or does Canada run the risk of getting caught flat-footed, right? Because other energy industries in other parts of the world are able to react better, and we lose an opportunity to be leaders in new technology, to be leaders in the development of new renewable and or traditional fossil-based fuels, but carbon-constrained. And so I've been thinking a lot about that. It might be that we can't come to a public decision, but the investor community comes to a decision ahead of us. And I've just been thinking about that for a little while, so I'd be curious to hear thoughts on that.
I'd suggest that our industry is, in the absence of that vision, we are taking action, and we're doing that without in the absence of federal leadership. Suncor just made a $1.4 billion announcement to switch out your cokers to cogen natural gas with a huge, what are their emissions reductions, Ginny?
0.5 megatons annually.
You know, we're so you've got projects at that scale. I can speak for my company. We're doing a tremendous amount of effort in reducing our methane emissions from our natural gas production. We've dropped our methane emissions intensity over the last 3 years in BC and Alberta by over 50%. So I think a lot of these actions are happening, and there's this assumption that industry isn't doing anything and isn't prepared to do our part. And I suggest and there's a lot of us in the room, every representative of the companies in the room have action plans and are contributing, and our view is to be part of the solution. Where we run into trouble is, and it gets back to the vision, and it gets back to the idea of what is the outcome we are trying to achieve. If you want to speak to me, and I'd suggest anybody in my spot in the room here that come from the industry, if you want to talk about how our industry can contribute to a lower carbon future, we've got all the time in the world. Where we struggle is, and it gets back to Marissa's work on transition that you referenced earlier. If the definition of transition is off fossil fuels completely, we have a difficult time with that conversation for a number of reasons. Not just the vested self-interest. A lot of us, we don't understand how you get there. I'm all about a how conversation, but every energy forecast we look at has a portion of hydrocarbons in the future energy mix. The world needs energy. There are billions of people that are striving to have our standard of living that need energy to pull themselves out of poverty. And we want to be part of that solution. So that's the how conversation, and that's, I think, where the conversations from the investment community are leading us, and that's certainly how I characterize and conduct those conversations when I do meet with investors, because that's part of my job. So the conversations are happening. I guess what we need to do as an industry is, and it gets back to those shared, honest conversations, is how do we make that visible? How do we make it known that we actually want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem?
Other comments from panelists on either on the comment from Stephen or what's just been said by Dave?
Can I throw it back to you, Monica? I'm just looking at the question up there about action items for positive energy and what Dave just said. Does positive energy have any, you talk about your case studies, you talk, like, how can we leverage like a Quest and a positive energy to help as that independent third party that doesn't have an invested interest in that outcome? How can we be used as a platform to kind of raise the fact that there is a lot of really, really positive things happening across Canada, both at the local level and with industry and with the financial sector in a number of different places? I think it's probably part of our role to try to elevate that as that independent.
Oh, I would agree. I would agree absolutely with that. And as I mentioned earlier in the day, we have a suite of methods that we're working with for this next 3-year phase, and one of them is what we refer to as what works case studies. So, we're in conversation with a number of different organizations, and Tonja, you would know that Quest is one of them. So is the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, so is CAMPUT, Canada's energy regulators, where, my own view is that we are in a process of unprecedented experimentation. There is so much going on across the country. There are a lot of initiatives that are actually working, but to your point, they aren't necessarily getting a lot of light shone on them. So I think that's definitely a role that we can take on. There's limits to how much we can do, but I think the idea of sort of putting in place this reflex to look for the positive is something that we'd like to try to instill not only in ourselves, but hopefully, hopefully going forward. So a big fat yes, I think, is the answer to your question. Were there any other comments from the audience? Yep, Stuart.
Yes. Thanks, Stuart Muir. Just a thought on the paradigm that we're in right now. Clearly, it's a moment of some maybe confusion. I just want to relate something. A few years ago, I took a trip out to the place in England where they make the jet engine. The Rolls-Royce company makes its engines, and we were talking to the executives there. One of them said, "We've gotten out of the engine business," which didn't make any sense whatsoever, because he was standing in front of this immense turbo fan the size of my cottage. He said, "We decided we would get into the power business," which was a very simple business strategy, which I think has been fairly widely embraced nowadays. But it stayed with me because they decided that they would provide to airlines the power they needed to go from point A to point B. And they wouldn't obsess about being in the engine manufacturing business. And I wonder if a lot of this that we're talking about as we get into the oil sands, or we talk about tar sands rather than oil sands, and further the polarization that way, or we talk about different aspects of power, transmission, solar, whatever it is, maybe we should be thinking about the provision of power to our citizens and to the world. And you think about where we are today. I think Canadians consumes 300 gigajoules a year of energy. It's about 2,000 calories a day, I think. So that's about 50 times what it was in prehistoric times. We use a lot of energy, and I suspect, all want to continue doing so. The well-being level is about 100 gigajoules in order to enjoy the sort of health that one wants to have. We're way, way above that. But 80% of the world is below 100. So as part of our national mission, as what was the phrase earlier, a superpower of many different kinds of energy, maybe we should be flipping it around. And rather than just focusing on some of the intrinsic problems of the energy potentialities we have, look at how we can be part of bringing 80% of the world, or even a portion of that, to the 100 gigajoules mark, and see if that is something that reduces the polarization, creates the opposite impetus.
Comments from the panel on that? Yeah, yes, yay, no?
Well, Stuart said much better than me. That's the vision that I'm talking about, and how can we, as a country, harness what we've got in a vision that makes the world a better place. And I think there's huge opportunities that our industry and all industries in Canada can contribute to fulfill the vision that Stuart laid out.
I think I saw a couple final questions here, and then we should probably start to close.
Bob Walker again. I just want to come back to Stephen's comment. I've been a government executive for close to 40 years, and one thing I've learned, and you've probably heard this said in other fora, is politicians don't like to lead a parade. They like to join a parade. And the reality is right now that at least 4, if not 5 of the political parties that are vying for the next election really don't have an embracing solution, vision if you like, that actually addresses what I might call the intersection of Maurice's reality 1 and reality 2. So that's the next 4 years. There's not an option really being put on the table. So if our answer is Ottawa, wake up and do something, we're waiting for the wrong leader. And so what are we missing? And my view is that the gap between what we're missing and action is actually not that big. And the opportunity is there for what I might call grassroots leadership. But my sense is to the extent to which society comes to government and says, we have an agreement that's intergenerational, that is the energy industry, that is environmental NGOs, is indigenous communities backed, then you're going to get the politicians to join the parade. But that's not been our practice. Our practice in Canada has been, let's wait for the federal government to do it. I would suggest that we can't afford to wait. We need a consensus. We need an agreement. And the players we need agreement among are represented in this room. What we need is a platform. I like the idea of principled approach. You know, I mean, too oftentimes I think we're running into solutions that are creating a conflicting dialogue that is mixing up the agenda that the average Canadian just doesn't get. So how is it we bridge it? And my view is, Monica, I wish you could just scale up ISSP. I mean, whether it's U of O, lead, or what have you, but my sense is we need that platform where we come together. I'm hearing great words out of oil and gas. I think it's there in renewables and nuclear as well. We have things we want to do, but there's actually ways of doing it that downplays the notion that there's got to be losers and get on with it. And that to me is perhaps, to me, the big idea coming out of this is how do we mobilize that effort to say back to governments, we actually agree on what needs to be done. Join our parade, as opposed to asking them to create it.
Thanks, Bob. Neil, and then we'll leave a final comment from each panelist.
I put my hand up to make a comment before we started addressing the globalization issue, and I'm so pleased that it has come up, and it was stimulated by the discussion about provincial actions. The thing I'd like to remind people of is probably for the first time, possibly the second, this is a global pollution problem. It makes no difference where you produce the CO2 anywhere in the world. And if we continue to address it parochially, just trying to deal with our own problem, we won't solve the problem. So I actually feel a moral obligation as someone who has benefited from being wealthy and brought up in a rich country to provide solutions to the developing countries, and I think other people should. If you don't feel that moral obligation, then from a self-serving point of view, if we don't fix the problems elsewhere in the world, what Canada does actually doesn't make any difference. And so I think that brings let's think more globally. And I can give you a recent example of where non-global thinking is causing damage. So there are a lot of people that would like to see Ontario replace its nuclear fleet by buying electricity from Quebec. Well, that Quebec electricity could go into the United States, where it will stop them burning coal and gas. Why would we want to sell it to Canada, where it would displace something that isn't producing any greenhouse gases anyway? It is environmentally the wrong thing to do. And it comes from this focus on regional solutions rather than dealing with a global problem. So it's not really a question, but it's an observation at the end of the day that this is a bigger problem than just Canada, and we have to think more broadly about our solutions.
Thank you, Neil. Maybe we'll move from the end towards me and give poor Aimee a break from being the first person on the spot all the time. Niilo, any final word or two from you?
Well, you know, I agree with the gentleman's comment over there that the solutions that we need are in this room, and that we have to find the platform, because waiting for government is not an option. I mean, Indigenous communities have been waiting for government since 1867, and look where we are today. So, you know, if we have the opportunity to work together and build the consensus that's needed and then get government to sign on, well, then let's do it.
So I would echo some of that. I think we have the platform, to be honest. I think it's Positive Energy, it's Quest, it's Pollution Probe, it's CHAD, the Energy Futures Lab, and there's probably others of you in the room that I haven't called out. But us combined makes the platform, and I think maybe we've got a little bit of work on. We should be taking on a little bit of work to figure out how we can actually leverage the work that we're each doing in a way that actually creates a solid platform versus kind of the pillars that make up the platform. So I think we've got a lot of the components in place. We've got the right people in the room from different perspectives, and it's just a matter of figuring out how we can actually leverage the opportunity that sits right before us.
I just build on that. I'd go back to the trajectory of my day, and this conversation leaves me quite optimistic and quite hopeful. And I think the trick is, Monica, is figure out how we harness this energy and action it, and figure out how we start talking about the how conversation, and how do we have those honest conversations so people are making informed decisions and trying to, if we can't get somebody to set the North Star for us, at least we can build consensus so we're pointing our leaders in the right direction.
Yeah, I would think again of Meredith earlier asked us to say sort of how we feel about polarization. And I think for young people like myself, there is a lot of fear around the question of climate change and what the future is going to look like. But similarly to what was said here, I also think that there's also a lot of hope, because there is a lot of people from across the board who want to make change. But unfortunately, I don't think we can wait for political parties, as also was said, to make that change for us. I think last week, 500,000 people in Montreal alone marching on the streets. What a political party would give anything to have that kind of numbers at a rally, right? But 500,000 people. So clearly the will is there. I think we just have to do more to get there. But, yeah.
Great, thank you. Thank you to all of you. Well, I'd like to invite you, first of all, to all join me in thanking the panel. This has been extremely helpful. Thank you so much. And before you all wander away, I'm just going to